Where did you get such an ugly sweater?
The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the calm kind, the kind that presses against your ears, heavy and expectant, as if the room itself is holding its breath. I stood just outside the glass doors of the 12th floor, my reflection faintly visible in the polished surface. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered once, briefly, and for a moment I considered turning around. Not because I was afraid, because I already knew how this would end. I adjusted the sleeves of my sweater. It was old, soft in some places, threadbare in others. The color was impossible to describe properly. Something between faded blue and ash gray, the result of dozens of careful washes and decades of quiet wear. The stitches along the left cuff were uneven, visibly repaired by hand. My grandmother's hand. I could still picture her fingers, thin and sure, guiding the needle as if she were signing her name into the fabric. "This will outlast both of us," she had said once, smiling. She was wrong. It outlasted her. And now it was all I had left. I pushed the door open. The office buzzed with its usual morning noise, keyboards clicking, phones vibrating, muted conversations about deadlines and meetings. People barely looked up as I walked in. That was normal. I'd learned long ago how to make myself invisible when needed. Emily Carter, senior analyst, reliable, quiet. The woman who always fixed things before they became disasters. I was halfway to my desk when it happened. A sharp laugh cut through the room. Not a polite chuckle, not amusement. A loud, unrestrained laugh that demanded attention. I froze. "Wow," Richard Coleman said, rising slightly from his chair. "Did we travel back in time today?" A few heads turned, then more. I felt it before I fully registered it. The heat creeping up my neck, the familiar tightening in my chest. Richard stepped into the aisle, coffee mug in hand, his tailored suit immaculate as always. Navy blue, Italian cut. The kind of suit that announced authority before he opened his mouth. He looked directly at me. "Seriously, Emily," he continued, smiling broadly. "Where did you get that ugly thing?" The word hung in the air. Ugly. Someone snorted. Someone else looked down at their screen a little too quickly. No one said anything. I stood there, my hands loosely clenched at my sides. For a brief second, 1,000 responses flashed through my mind. Sharp ones, professional ones, ones that would make him look small. I said nothing. Richard tilted his head, clearly enjoying the moment. "Is it some kind of statement?" he added. "Because if it is, HR might want a word." A few nervous laughs followed. The silence returned, thicker now, charged with expectation. Everyone was watching to see how I'd react. They always did. I was predictable. I would smile faintly, apologize, retreat. I felt the weight of the sweater on my shoulders. This was the only thing I'd kept when my grandmother died. No jewelry, no furniture, just this. Because she had worn it when she taught me how to read contracts, when she showed me how to balance a checkbook, when she told me that people who laugh the loudest often know the least. Richard didn't know that. He didn't know that the numbers in last quarter's report, the ones the board praised him for, had been corrected by me at 2 a.m. He didn't know that the vendor contract he bragged about securing had contained a clause that would have cost the company millions if I hadn't quietly rewritten it. He didn't know how many times I had cleaned his messes before anyone noticed the smell. To him, I was just Emily, the quiet one, the safe one. "Well?" he prompted. "Cat got your tongue?" I met his eyes. For a fraction of a second, something shifted. Not in him, in me. I felt it crack. Not loudly, not dramatically. Something deep and internal, like the soundless breaking of ice beneath still water. A realization settling into place with absolute clarity. This wasn't about the sweater. It never had been. It was about how easily I had allowed myself to become invisible. How often I had confused silence with safety. How many times I had chosen to endure instead of decide. "I like it," I said finally. My voice was calm, even, almost neutral. Richard blinked, clearly disappointed. "Well," he shrugged, already turning away. "To each their own. Try not to scare the clients." He walked back to his office, laughter trailing behind him like an echo. The room slowly returned to normal. Screens lit up again. Conversations resumed. Just another morning. I sat down at my desk and logged in. My inbox was already full. Requests, questions, problems waiting to be solved. I stared at the screen, my reflection faintly visible in the black glass for a moment before the system fully loaded. My grandmother's voice echoed in my mind, uninvited but steady. "Silence isn't weakness, Emily. It's a choice." I placed my hands on the keyboard, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible at all. People think they know Richard Coleman. They see the confidence first, the straight posture, the measured tone, the way he walks into meetings like the outcome has already been decided in his favor. To them, he's decisive, sharp, the kind of manager companies like to promote because he looks like leadership. I used to believe that image too. When I joined the company 6 years ago, Richard had already been there for a decade. He was respected, feared, and carefully untouchable. His name carried weight in emails. His approval opened doors. When he spoke, people listened, not because he was always right, but because he never hesitated. I learned very quickly that hesitation is often the only thing separating competence from arrogance. My job title said senior analyst. In practice, I was something else entirely. I was the quiet space between his decisions and their consequences, the margin where mistakes disappeared, the invisible hands that held the structure together when it started to lean. The first time I fixed one of his mistakes, I didn't even realize that's what I was doing. It was a financial projection for a mid-sized acquisition. Richard had presented it to the board with confidence, highlighting expected growth, minimal risk, clean numbers. I was asked to double-check it for formatting before it went into the archive. Formatting. That was the word they used when they didn't want to admit fear. I remember opening the file late in the evening, the office already quiet, lights dimmed automatically to save electricity. At first glance, everything looked fine. Too fine. Numbers aligned too perfectly, growth curves smooth in a way real life never is. Then I noticed it. A single assumption buried deep in the spreadsheet. One variable copied incorrectly across multiple sheets. A small error, barely noticeable, but one that, compounded over 5 years, inflated projected profits by nearly 8%. 8% was the difference between a smart acquisition and a lawsuit. My heart raced as I recalculated everything. Then again. Then once more, just to be sure. By the time I finished, my coffee was cold and my hands were shaking. I sent Richard an email. Carefully worded, respectful, no accusations. "Hi Richard, I noticed a minor inconsistency in the projection assumptions. I've attached a revised version for your review." He replied 10 minutes later. "Good catch. Use yours." That was it. No questions, no curiosity about how close we had come to disaster. No acknowledgement beyond 2 words. I told myself it was fine, that this was teamwork, that this was how offices worked. It became a pattern. Contracts with contradictory clauses that would have allowed vendors to walk away penalty-free, fixed quietly before signatures. Reports with misaligned data sources, reconciled after hours. Regulatory language misused just enough to attract attention. Corrected before compliance noticed. Each time, Richard presented the final version as his own work. Each time, I stayed silent. Not because I was afraid of him, because I was afraid of what speaking up would change. I was young enough then to believe that loyalty would be noticed, that consistency would be rewarded, that someone, eventually, would connect the dots. They never did. Over the years, colleagues came to rely on me without ever quite acknowledging why. Emily will know. Ask Emily, she's good with details. Emily can probably fix it. Fix. That word followed me everywhere. Richard, meanwhile, grew bolder, louder, more careless. He stopped double-checking numbers altogether. He skimmed contracts. He interrupted people mid-sentence in meetings, dismissing concerns with a wave of his hand. And every time someone hesitated, unsure, I felt their eyes drift, unconsciously, toward me. As if I were the safety net they assumed would always be there. I should have seen it then. The way dependence quietly replaces respect. The way invisibility becomes expectation. But I didn't. I told myself I was being strategic, that staying in the background gave me control, that silence protected me. What I didn't understand was that silence doesn't just hide you from danger, it hides your value too. The morning after the sweater incident, I opened my inbox to find a message from Richard marked urgent. Need you to review the preliminary numbers for the Harrison deal. Quick turnaround. No greeting. No mention of yesterday. No apology. Just expectation. I stared at the email longer than necessary. Around me, the office hummed as usual. Phones rang, chairs rolled. Someone laughed near the break room. Richard assumed I would do what I always did. And for the first time, I realized how completely he took me for granted. He never knew how close he'd come to failing before. He never knew how much of his success rested on my quiet corrections. And he never once considered what would happen if I stopped fixing his mistakes. I closed the email without replying. Not yet. Outside my office window, the city moved on. Indifferent. Relentless. I rested my hands on the desk, feeling the coarse fabric of my sweater brush against my wrists. My grandmother had always said that the most dangerous thing in any system isn't incompetence. It's the person who assumes someone else will clean up after them. For years, that person had been me. And Richard Coleman had no idea what he was about to lose. People think they understand Richard Coleman because he is easy to read on the surface. He speaks loudly. He smiles when he wants approval. He raises his voice when he wants control. In meetings, he leans back in his chair with his hands folded behind his head, as if the numbers on the screen are merely formalities, as if the outcome has already bent itself to his will. To the executives, he is decisive. To clients, reassuring. To junior employees, intimidating. To me, he was something else entirely. When I joined the company 6 years ago, I didn't even work directly with Richard. I was just another analyst assigned to support projects from a distance. I reviewed spreadsheets, checked assumptions, validated contracts. Quiet work, invisible work. The kind that only gets noticed when it isn't done. The first time I saved him, I didn't realize that's what I was doing. It was late, past 9, and I had already packed my bag when an email came in with a subject line that said, "Final numbers, archive tonight." Richard's name was on it. He wanted me to do a quick consistency check. Nothing more. I remember opening the file and feeling that familiar tightening in my stomach. Not panic, instinct. The numbers were clean, too clean. Revenue projections rose smoothly quarter after quarter, as if markets never fluctuated, as if people never made mistakes. Risk was technically listed, but understated, buried behind optimistic assumptions that no serious regulator would ever accept. I checked the formulas, then the sources, then the footnotes. That's when I saw it. One assumption, copied across 12 linked sheets, was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, subtly wrong. The kind of mistake that wouldn't show up immediately, but would quietly grow into something catastrophic once money actually moved. If the deal went through as presented, the company wouldn't just lose profit, it would lose credibility. I recalculated everything, twice. Then a third time, slower, calmer, forcing myself not to rush. By the time I finished, my coffee had gone cold and the cleaning crew had already passed my desk. I rewrote the projections and sent Richard the corrected version with a careful message. No blame, no explanation. He replied 10 minutes later. Good catch, use yours. That was the moment something shifted. Not in him, but in how the system began to see me. After that, my inbox filled differently. Files arrived with vague instructions. Can you just check this? Something feels off here. Before this goes up the chain? Always before. Never after. Richard never mentioned my work in meetings. He never acknowledged my role publicly. But he began to rely on me with absolute confidence. He stopped checking details himself. He forwarded me documents he hadn't even opened yet. Contracts came next. Vendor agreements with contradictory clauses. Termination penalties written so loosely they were practically invitations for lawsuits. Jurisdiction errors that could have cost us years in court. I fixed them all. Quietly, carefully, often after hours. When I sent revised versions, Richard would respond with a thumbs-up emoji. Sometimes, not even that. And still, I stayed silent. I told myself this was strategy. That influence didn't require visibility. That power worked best from the shadows. I told myself that loyalty mattered, that consistency would be rewarded eventually. But what really happened was simpler and more dangerous. Richard stopped seeing me as a colleague. I became infrastructure, like electricity, like plumbing, something essential that only gets attention when it fails. Over time, others noticed too. Team members began copying me instead of him. They asked for my input quietly, in hallways, over coffee. Just between us, they'd say. Does this make sense to you? They trusted me, but never enough to say it out loud. And Richard? He grew louder, more careless. He interrupted compliance officers mid-sentence. He dismissed legal concerns as overthinking. He joked about analysts who hid behind spreadsheets instead of making real decisions. He started taking credit not just for outcomes, but for competence itself. Every time something almost went wrong, I fixed it before anyone noticed. Every time I did, I made him stronger. The sweater incident didn't come out of nowhere. It was the natural result of years of unchecked arrogance and my own carefully maintained silence. Richard believed he was untouchable because, in practice, he had been. Because I had made him so. The morning after he laughed at me, I opened my inbox and saw his name again. Urgent. Emily, need you to clean up the numbers for the Harrison deal. Presentable by end of day. Clean up. Not review, not verify. Clean up. I stared at the message longer than necessary. Around me, the office moved as usual. Keyboards clicking, phones ringing, conversations flowing. No one noticed the way my hands stilled on the desk. No one saw the weight of that word settle in my chest. For years, I had been correcting mistakes before they mattered. Richard never asked what would happen if I didn't. He never wondered how much of his confidence was borrowed. He never questioned why his risks always seemed to resolve themselves. And he never imagined a version of this company where I chose not to protect him. I didn't reply to the email. Not yet. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the rough fabric of my sweater against my wrists, and understood something with absolute clarity. Richard Coleman didn't know who he really was, because he had never had to face the consequences of being wrong. The memory comes to me at the most inconvenient moment. I'm sitting at my desk staring at the unopened file for the Harrison deal when the smell of old paper and chamomile tea fills my mind, so vivid it almost pulls me out of the office. It's ridiculous, really, The air around me smells like printer toner and burnt coffee, not herbs and dust. But memory doesn't ask permission. It arrives when it wants to. My grandmother's apartment was always quiet. Not empty. Quiet. The kind of quiet that wraps around you instead of pressing down. She lived on the third floor of a gray building that looked exactly like every other one on the street. No elevator, narrow stairs, paint peeling at the corners. But inside, everything had a place, and nothing was rushed. She used to say that disorder was just another form of impatience. I was 11 the first time she taught me how to sit with silence. I had come to her crying, furious at a girl in my class who had lied about me. I wanted to confront her, to shout, to force the truth out into the open. I remember pacing the small kitchen, my fists clenched, words tumbling over each other as I spoke. My grandmother listened without interrupting. When I finally ran out of breath, she poured tea into 2 chipped cups and pushed one toward me. Then she sat down across from me, folded her hands, and waited. "For what?" I asked, exasperated. "Why aren't you saying anything?" She smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, thoughtfully. "Because you're still speaking from anger," she said. "And anger is loud. It wants to be heard immediately." "So what am I supposed to do?" I demanded. "Wait," she replied simply. "Silence first, action second." I hated that answer back then. Over the years, she repeated that lesson in 100 different ways. When my father lost his job, when my mother panicked over money, when neighbors gossiped, when relatives argued over inheritance that didn't even exist yet. "Silence isn't weakness, Emily," she would say, threading a needle with steady hands. "It's information. People reveal more when you don't interrupt them." The sweater came later. She knitted most of her life, but this one she stitched differently. She reused old yarn, reinforced the seams, adjusted it again and again, as if she were building something meant to endure stress. I remember teasing her for it. "It's ugly," I had said, wrinkling my nose. She laughed, a soft, dry laugh. "Good," she replied. "Then it won't distract from what matters." "What matters?" I asked. She held the sweater up against me, squinting critically. "That it lasts. That it keeps you warm. That you know who made it and why." Years later, when she died, I found it folded carefully at the top of her closet. Clean, repaired, waiting. Everything else felt replaceable. This didn't. I hadn't worn it to the office as a statement, not consciously. That was the part that unsettled me most. Some part of me had simply reached for it that morning, for familiarity, for grounding, without realizing what it would expose. Richard's laughter echoed faintly in my mind. "Where did you get that ugly thing?" The question itself didn't hurt. Questions rarely do. What hurt was the certainty behind it. The assumption that something with meaning to me could be reduced to a joke for him. That dignity was negotiable. That I would absorb the insult and move on, like always. My grandmother would have noticed that immediately. She had a gift for seeing patterns long before they became problems. She could spot imbalance in a room the way others spotted dust. She would have watched Richard for 5 minutes and understood him completely. "He's careless," she would have said, "and you are compensating for it." "How do you know?" I imagine myself asking. "Because he is loud," she would answer, "and you are quiet." At my desk, I finally opened the Harrison file. Not to work on it, but to look at it. Really look. The same familiar flaws were there. Overconfidence disguised as simplicity. Risks brushed aside with optimistic language. Numbers rounded up instead of down. Richard hadn't changed. I had. For years, I thought my grandmother's lessons were about endurance, about surviving, about staying composed while others lost control. But sitting there, wrapped in the faint warmth of that sweater, I understood something I hadn't before. Silence wasn't meant to last forever. It was meant to buy time. Time to observe. Time to prepare. Time to choose the moment that mattered. I had been silent for years, not strategically, but habitually. I had mistaken restraint for submission, patience for obligation. And Richard had benefited from every one of those misunderstandings. I closed the file again. Around me, the office continued its rhythm, unaware that anything had shifted. People laughed. Someone complained about a printer jam. Life moved forward in small, ordinary ways. Inside me, something settled. The sweater wasn't just memory, it was a reminder of who I was before I learned to disappear, of what my grandmother had actually taught me. Silence is not surrender, it is leverage. And for the first time, I knew exactly when I intended to use it. The email comes at 3:17 p.m. I know the exact time because I'm watching the clock when my inbox refreshes, not waiting for anything in particular, just aware in a way I hadn't been before. Awareness does that. It sharpens ordinary moments until they feel deliberate. From Richard Coleman. Subject: Quick fix. Emily, there's a small issue in Section 4 of the Harrison contract. Nothing major. Can you clean it up before EOD? Small issue. That phrase has followed me for years, always dressed in false modesty. Small issue meant risk buried in fine print. Small issue meant potential losses disguised as optimism. Small issue meant I made a mistake, but I don't want to look at it. I don't open the attachment. Instead, I read the email again, slowly, as if it were evidence. Nothing major. Clean it up. Before end of day. No pleas. No explanation. No acknowledgement of yesterday morning, of the laughter, of the humiliation delivered casually between sips of coffee. Richard doesn't apologize because, in his mind, nothing happened. I absorbed it. That's what I do. Around me, the office is alive in that late afternoon way, restless but contained. Chairs scrape softly. Someone reheats lunch they never finished. The low murmur of conversations drifts over the partitions like background noise in a cafe. I swivel slightly in my chair and look toward Richard's office. The glass walls are transparent by design, modern, symbolic, pretending openness. He's inside, pacing while talking on his phone, one hand gesturing sharply in the air. Confident, unconcerned, already moving on to the next thing. He assumes I will too. I think of all the other times I said yes without realizing it was a choice. The night I stayed until midnight correcting a report that went out under his name. The weekend I rewrote a vendor agreement while he sent emails from a golf course. The morning I fixed a compliance issue before regulators noticed, and he took credit for anticipating concerns. Each time I told myself it was temporary, strategic, necessary. Each time the line moved. My grandmother's voice returns, quiet but firm. Silence is only power if it's chosen. I turn back to my screen. The attachment icon sits there, untouched, like a test I already know the answers to. I don't need to open it to know what's inside. I've seen Richard's work often enough to predict the shape of his mistakes. Overconfidence, assumptions left unchallenged, language that looks decisive but collapses under scrutiny. I rest my hands on the keyboard. For a moment, I consider responding the way I always have. Sure, I'll take a look. No problem, I'll handle it. The words form easily in my mind, muscle memory guiding my fingers. I don't type them. Instead, I do something that feels almost absurd in its simplicity. I close my laptop. The soft click of the lid sounds louder than it should. Final. Irreversible. I check the time again. 3:24 p.m. I stand, slip my bag over my shoulder and straighten my sweater. The fabric catches slightly on my watch. A small imperfection, carefully mended years ago. I smooth it down. As I step into the aisle, a colleague looks up in surprise. Leaving already? She asks, half joking. I smile, not apologetically, just neutrally. Yeah, I'm done for today. She blinks, processing, then nods slowly, as if filing the moment away for later. I walk past Richard's office. He's still on the phone, laughing now, leaning casually against his desk. He doesn't see me at first. When he does, our eyes meet through the glass. His smile falters for a fraction of a second. I don't wave. I don't stop. I don't explain. I keep walking. The elevator ride down feels strange. Not tense, not triumphant. Just quiet. My reflection stares back at me from the mirrored wall, and for the first time in a long while, I recognize the woman looking back. Not smaller, not apologetic, not bracing for impact. Outside, the late afternoon air is cool, the city humming with movement. Cars rush past. People hurry toward trains, buses, homes. Life, indifferent and unstoppable. My phone vibrates. A message from Richard. Emily? Did you see my email? I slip the phone back into my bag without answering. For years, I believed that responsibility meant availability, that professionalism meant absorption, that being valuable meant being indispensable, even at the cost of my own boundaries. Standing there on the sidewalk, the office building looming behind me, I finally understand the flaw in that logic. If your value depends on being exploited, it was never value. It was convenience. I walk away. Not dramatically, not angrily, decisively. Behind me, Richard Coleman still believes the system will correct itself, that someone will step in, that mistakes will soften before they become consequences. He doesn't realize that for the first time, I've chosen not to be that person. The decision doesn't feel loud. It feels inevitable. And as I disappear into the crowd, wrapped in the quiet strength of my grandmother's sweater, I know one thing with absolute certainty. This is the moment everything begins to change. The Harrison deal arrives like a storm everyone insists will be sunny. By the time I walk into the office the next morning, the tension is already there. Buzzing under the usual routine, sharpening voices, tightening smiles. People stand in small clusters, whispering instead of typing. Coffee cups are refilled more often than usual. Even the air feels heavier, as if the building itself senses what's at stake. This isn't just another contract. This is the deal. High-profile clients, international exposure, a partnership that, if successful, would place our company on an entirely different level. Tens of millions in projected revenue, executive bonuses, press releases already half-written in someone's draft folder. And Richard Coleman is at the center of it all. He walks in late, as usual, wearing a charcoal suit and a grin that says he's already won. He greets people loudly, claps one junior manager on the shoulder, jokes about how today decides who earns their paycheck. The laughter around him is nervous, eager, obedient. I sit at my desk and observe. No one asks me about the numbers. No one checks whether I've reviewed the latest version of the contract. No one notices that the final files were uploaded without my name anywhere near them. That, more than anything, tells me how invisible my role had become. Richard stops by my desk around 10, leaning casually against the partition. "Big day," he says, flashing that confident smile. "Hope you're ready." Ready. The word almost makes me laugh. "I'm ready," I reply, truthfully, though not in the way he means. He nods, satisfied, and moves on without another thought. He assumes readiness is automatic. That preparation happens somewhere behind the scenes, the way electricity flows through walls without ever being seen. The meeting is scheduled for noon. By 11:30, the conference room is packed. Executives dial in from other cities. The Harrison representatives sit across the table, polished and unreadable, their legal team arranged neatly beside them. A screen at the front of the room displays the title slide Richard insisted on designing himself. Strategic Growth Partnership. I take a seat near the back, notebook closed, hands folded. No laptop, no spreadsheets open. For the first time in years, I am not armed with fixes. Richard begins confidently, as always. He speaks of vision, of synergy, of long-term value. He gestures toward charts and graphs that glide smoothly across the screen. Growth curves rise elegantly. Risk appears minimal. Everything looks inevitable. I recognize the numbers immediately. They are almost right. That's what makes them dangerous. At first, no one notices. Heads nod. Notes are taken. A few approving murmurs ripple around the table. Richard relaxes visibly, feeding off the response. He starts improvising, adding flourishes that weren't rehearsed, trusting his instincts the way he always does. Then the questions begin. A Harrison executive leans forward slightly. "Can you clarify the revenue assumptions in year 3? He asks calmly. Richard doesn't hesitate. He answers smoothly. But he answers wrong. Just slightly. I feel it like a physical sensation, a tightening behind my ribs. I know that number. I corrected it once, months ago, in an earlier draft. The version on the screen reverted back to the optimistic estimate Richard preferred. Another question follows. Then another. A lawyer points out a clause that seems to contradict an earlier statement. A financial advisor asks about currency exposure. Someone mentions regulatory timing. The room shifts. The easy confidence drains away, replaced by careful scrutiny. Richard's voice changes, still firm, but sharper now, defensive at the edges. He clicks through slides faster, skipping details instead of explaining them. I watch his hands. They're trembling. He glances toward me once, not directly, but instinctively, as if expecting me to meet his eye and step in, to interrupt, to clarify, to save him. I don't move. I sit very still, my sweater soft against my wrists, my face neutral. The Harrison team exchanges looks. Quiet ones, professional ones, the kind that signal concern without saying it out loud. When Richard finally finishes, the silence that follows is devastating. Not hostile, not dramatic, just cold. Thank you, the lead Harrison representative says at last. We'll need some time to reassess the risk profile based on what we've heard today. Reassess. That single word lands harder than any accusation. The meeting adjourns shortly after. People stand slowly, gathering their things with forced composure. Richard shakes hands, still smiling, but the smile no longer reaches his eyes. He's sweating now. I can see it along his hairline. As the room empties, he turns to me sharply. Emily, he says under his breath, why didn't you say anything? I look at him. Really look at him. At the man who laughed at my sweater. At the manager who never asked how things stayed afloat. At the person who assumed silence was obligation. You didn't ask, I reply. For a moment he looks stunned, as if the concept itself is foreign. Then his expression hardens. We'll talk later, he snaps. I nod once. We will. But not on his terms. As I leave the conference room, I feel something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not guilt. Not fear. Relief. For the first time, the deal is no longer mine to carry. The consequences belong to the person who made the decisions, not the one who used to erase their fallout. Behind me, Richard Coleman stares at the empty room, finally alone with numbers that no longer obey him. And somewhere deep inside, I know this is only the beginning. The collapse doesn't happen all at once. That's what surprises me most. I always imagined failure as something loud, raised voices, slammed doors, dramatic accusations flying across the office, but what actually unfolds is quieter, slower, and far more unsettling. Like watching a crack spread across glass you thought was unbreakable. It begins with whispers. By mid-afternoon, the Harrison team has sent a follow-up email, polite, carefully worded, full of phrases like clarification needed, unresolved discrepancies, and risk reassessment. The kind of language lawyers use when they're already preparing to walk away. Richard is pacing again. I can see him through the glass walls of his office, phone pressed to his ear, jaw clenched so tightly it looks painful. His movements are sharp now, clipped. Gone is the relaxed swagger, the casual confidence. This is a man trying to outrun consequences he never believed would catch him. Around the office, people sense it. No one says anything directly, but the atmosphere shifts. Conversations stop when Richard walks by. Emails are reread before being sent. A few coworkers glance at me, not openly, not accusingly, but with a new kind of curiosity, as if they're realizing too late that I was more than just background. I open my inbox. There are 3 new messages from Richard. Emily, I need the revised projections, ASAP. Did you update the currency exposure section? Please tell me you fixed the contract language. Please. That word appears for the first time in 6 years. I don't reply. Instead, I scroll calmly through the Harrison contract. The untouched file still sitting exactly where he sent it. The errors are all there, clearer now than ever. Misaligned assumptions, contradictory clauses, a regulatory oversight that would raise red flags the moment any external auditor looked closely. It would take me an hour to fix. Maybe less. I close the file. Across the aisle, someone pretends to reorganize their desk for the 3rd time. Another colleague stares at their screen without typing. Everyone is waiting for something, for someone, to step in. Richard bursts out of his office. Emily, he says sharply, no longer bothering to lower his voice. Why aren't you responding? The room goes still. Every head turns. This is it. The moment he expects me to fall back into place, to apologize, to explain, to quietly take responsibility for what is unraveling around him. I look up slowly. I'm not assigned to that task, I say evenly. His face flushes red. You always handle this stuff. Not handled before. Always. That's never been in my job description, I reply. A beat of silence. Richard laughs, a short, brittle sound that fools no one. Now is not the time for technicalities. No, I agree calmly. It's the time for accuracy. The word seems to hit him physically. He leans closer, lowering his voice. If this deal falls apart, it's on all of us. I meet his gaze without flinching. No, it's on the people who approved it. For a moment, I think he might say something cruel, something cutting, something designed to put me back in my place. Instead, he looks scared. Truly scared. He straightens abruptly and storms back into his office, slamming the glass door so hard it rattles. Phones start ringing again. Typing resumes, louder than before, as if noise might restore normality. It doesn't. By evening, the collapse accelerates. The Harrison team requests a postponement, then a formal review. Then, finally, they suspend negotiations entirely pending internal approval. The language is still polite, but the message is unmistakable. They no longer trust us. An emergency meeting is called with upper management. Richard goes in alone. He comes out 40 minutes later looking 10 years older. His tie is loosened. His hands are shaking. He doesn't look at me. By the time I shut down my computer for the day, the office is buzzing with quiet panic. People speculate in whispers, already distancing themselves, already rewriting the narrative in their heads. I walk toward the elevator, my steps steady. As the doors close, I catch a glimpse of Richard through the narrowing gap, slumped in his chair, staring at his screen as if the numbers might rearrange themselves out of pity. They won't. Outside, the sky is darkening, clouds gathering low and heavy. I pause on the sidewalk, breathing in the cool air, grounding myself. I don't feel victorious. I feel clear. For years, I believed preventing collapse was my responsibility, that holding everything together was proof of my worth. Now I understand something my grandmother tried to teach me long ago. Some structures deserve to fall, because only then can you see what they were really built on. And as I walk away from the building, I know with certainty that tomorrow will bring questions no one can ignore. The collapse has begun, and this time, I am not standing underneath it. The number doesn't appear on a screen at first. It arrives in fragments, whispered conversations, half-finished sentences, sudden silences when someone notices me nearby. Numbers like this never enter a room honestly. They seep in, piece by piece, until everyone feels their weight before anyone dares to say them out loud. I hear it for the first time in the break room. Two managers stand near the coffee machine, speaking in low voices. They stop when I enter, then resume too quickly, too carelessly, assuming I won't connect the dots. Legal exposure alone? Currency mismatch. They pulled out completely. I pour myself coffee slowly, deliberately, listening. 20 million. One of them finally mutters. At least? The cup trembles slightly in my hand, not from shock, but from recognition. I knew it would be high. I just hadn't expected it to crystallize so fast. $20 million. Not projected loss, not hypothetical risk. Actual damage. By noon, it's official. An internal memo circulates from finance, marked confidential, then forwarded so many times it might as well be public. The Harrison deal is terminated. Penalty clauses are triggered. Hedging failures compound the exposure. Stock response is already negative. Estimated loss, $20,000. The office reacts the way organisms do when injured. First comes denial. This can't be right. They'll renegotiate. Legal will fix it. Then fear. People stop smiling. Doors close. Calendars suddenly fill with emergency meetings. Someone from HR walks briskly down the hallway with a folder clutched too tightly to be casual. And finally, instinct. Everyone starts looking for distance. I feel it in the way conversations change tone when I approach. In the way people suddenly remember emails they sent, decisions they didn't approve, meetings they were only present for. The air thickens with self-preservation. Richard hasn't left his office all morning. When he finally emerges, it's not with authority. It's with desperation poorly disguised as control. He calls a meeting with senior staff, his voice too loud, his instructions scattered. He talks about team accountability, about unexpected market variables, about shared responsibility. No one interrupts him. No one supports him either. I sit at my desk, watching the glass walls of his office reflect a version of him I barely recognize. His shoulders are hunched, his hair is disheveled. The confidence that once radiated from him like armor has collapsed inward, leaving only fear behind. My phone buzzes. A message from Richard. Emily, we need to talk. Now. I don't respond immediately. Instead, I reread the memo. Slowly, carefully, line by line, every issue listed is familiar. Every risk cited is one I corrected in the past. Every consequence is one I quietly prevented. Until now. There is no satisfaction in that realization. Only clarity. I finally stand and walk toward his office. Not because he summoned me, but because this conversation was inevitable. When I step inside, he doesn't tell me to sit. He doesn't offer small talk. He just stares at me, eyes bloodshot, jaw tight. Did you know this would happen? He asks. The question is almost childlike. I consider lying, softening it, protecting him one last time. I knew it was possible, I say instead. He exhales sharply, running a hand through his hair. You could have stopped it. Yes, I reply. The word hangs between us. Why didn't you? He demands. I meet his gaze, steady and unflinching. Because it wasn't my responsibility anymore. His face contorts, anger, disbelief, fear colliding all at once. You let the company lose $20 million, he says, as if accusing me of a crime. I shake my head. No. I stopped hiding who was responsible. Silence crashes down. For a long moment, Richard says nothing. Then his shoulders slump, just slightly. They're asking questions, he mutters. Real questions. I nod. They should. When I leave his office, the atmosphere outside feels different. Heavier. More honest. People don't look at me with curiosity anymore. They look at me with understanding. By the end of the day, the number is everywhere. Unspoken, but undeniable. 20 million. A crater no one can ignore. A loss too large to bury under excuses. As I shut down my computer and gather my things, I realize something quietly profound. For the first time, the cost of Richard Coleman's arrogance is visible. Not hidden in spreadsheets, not absorbed by someone else, not erased by silence. It has a number now. And numbers, unlike people, cannot be intimidated. As I step into the evening air, the city moving on around me, I feel the weight of that realization settle, not as guilt, but as truth. The damage is real. So are the questions that will follow. And tomorrow, someone will have to answer them. They don't come for Richard first. That's what surprises everyone. The internal investigation begins quietly, almost politely, disguised as process. Emails arrive requesting documentation. Calendars fill with alignment meetings. Legal and compliance step in wearing neutral expressions and carefully chosen words. No accusations, no conclusions, just questions. The kind that don't need to be aggressive because they already know the answers are there. Somewhere. By mid-morning, an email appears in my inbox. Subject: Request for discussion from Internal Review Committee. I read it once, then again. My hands don't shake. That, more than anything, tells me how long I've been waiting for this. The meeting room is smaller than I expect. No boardroom, no long table meant to intimidate. Just 4 people seated evenly, notebooks open, voices calm. Legal, compliance, finance, HR. Each of them nods as I enter, professional and unreadable. Thank you for coming, Emily. One of them says. This won't take long. It never does. When the truth is already organized, they start with neutral ground. My role, my responsibilities, how long I've been with the company. Then the questions sharpen. Can you walk us through your involvement in the Harrison deal? How often were you asked to revise projections prepared by Mr. Coleman? Were you formally assigned responsibility for contract corrections? I answer carefully. Not defensively, not emotionally, precisely. I explain how files arrived at my desk labeled as final, but clearly unfinished. How assumptions were copied forward without review. How contracts contained errors that would have exposed the company to serious risk. How, over time, correcting these issues became expected rather than requested. I don't exaggerate. I don't minimize. I simply describe how things worked. They exchange looks, subtle, practiced, the kind that say this matches what we're seeing elsewhere. Were you aware of the errors in the final Harrison documents before the meeting? One of them asks. Yes. Why weren't they corrected? The question is asked without judgment, but it's the most important one in the room. For the first time, I say calmly, I wasn't assigned to correct them, and I chose not to take responsibility for work that wasn't mine. Silence. Not shock. Not outrage. Consideration. Someone writes something down. Another nods slowly. Did Mr. Coleman ask you to fix the issues? They ask. Yes. And you declined? I didn't decline. I clarify. I didn't accept. The distinction matters. They ask about previous deals, other contracts, other instances where my revisions prevented losses. I provide dates, examples, emails, version histories. Not because I prepared for this moment, but because I lived it. By the end of the meeting, the atmosphere has shifted. Not toward blame, toward understanding. When I leave the room, Richard is waiting in the hallway. He looks smaller here, stripped of his office and authority, standing under fluorescent lights like everyone else. His eyes flick toward the closed door behind me. "What did you tell them?" he asks. "The truth," I reply. His jaw tightens. "You didn't have to destroy me." I look at him for a long moment. "I didn't," I say quietly. "I stopped protecting you." The difference finally lands. He doesn't respond. In the days that follow, the questions spread. Others are called in. Emails are reviewed. Patterns emerge, not just about Richard, but about how easily competence can be hidden when it's quiet, and how loudly confidence can fail when it's unsupported. I keep working. No drama, no speeches, just my job. Clearly defined, clearly owned. People treat me differently now. With care, with respect. Sometimes with discomfort. Because once you see how things really work, you can't unsee it. One afternoon, I catch my reflection in the glass of a conference room. The same sweater, the same woman. But the way I stand is different. Straighter. Grounded. Unafraid. My grandmother used to say that truth doesn't need volume, it needs timing. And now, finally, the timing is right. The questions are no longer whispered. They're written down. And this time, silence isn't hiding the answers. It's making room for them. The executive meeting is scheduled for 8 sharp, not 8:05, not around 8. 8. The kind of precision that signals consequence. When I arrive, the hallway outside the executive floor is already quiet, emptied of its usual noise as if the building itself has learned restraint. I wear the same sweater, not out of defiance, not to make a point, simply because it feels right. Like armor that doesn't need to look like armor to work. The fabric rests against my skin with familiar weight, steadying, grounding. A few people notice. No one comments. That silence is different from the one I've known all these years. It isn't dismissive. It isn't careless. It's careful. Inside the boardroom, the long table gleams under the lights. Executives are already seated, tablets open, expressions composed. The CEO sits at the head, hands folded, unreadable. Legal and compliance occupy one side, finance the other, and across the table from where I'm directed to sit, Richard. He looks nothing like the man who laughed that morning in the open office. His suit is the same, but it hangs differently now, as if the confidence that once filled it has drained away. His shoulders are drawn inward. His face is pale, lips pressed thin. He doesn't meet my eyes at first. When he finally does, there is no arrogance left, only exposure. The meeting begins without preamble. Facts are presented, timelines laid out, screens display version histories, drafts evolving, edits appearing and disappearing, responsibility shifting in silent metadata. No opinions, no emotion, just evidence. The sweater itches slightly at my wrist. I welcome the sensation. It keeps me present. I'm asked to speak. I don't stand. I don't project. I simply explain how work flowed, how corrections became expectations, how silence slowly replaced accountability. I describe the system, not the man, because the system is what allowed him to exist as he did. Richard shifts beside me. Once he opens his mouth as if to interrupt, then stops. There is nothing left to interrupt. When he's finally asked to respond, his voice sounds unfamiliar even to himself. He speaks of pressure, of pace, of trust, of assuming things would be handled the way they always had been. No one argues with him. They don't need to. The CEO looks at him for a long moment, then turns to me. "Ms. Carter," he says evenly, "thank you for your transparency." That word again, transparency. It used to frighten me. Now it feels like relief. The decision isn't announced immediately. It doesn't need to be. Everyone in the room understands what's coming. Authority doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it simply closes a file. As people begin to gather their things, Richard finally looks at me again. There's no accusation left in his eyes. Only something like regret. "You could have warned me," he says quietly. I consider the statement, then shake my head. "I did," I reply. "For years." He has no answer to that. When the meeting ends, I remain seated for a moment longer, letting the room empty around me. The sweater feels warmer now, as if absorbing the moment, holding it the way it once held my grandmother's patience, her resolve. I stand and walk out slowly. In the hallway, the glass walls reflect me back. Unchanged in appearance, utterly changed in presence. People step aside without realizing they're doing it, not out of fear, out of recognition. For the first time, I understand something clearly. Respect doesn't arrive with volume. It arrives with consistency, and the courage to stop carrying what isn't yours. Behind me, Richard Coleman remains in that room a little longer, surrounded by proof he can no longer outrun. Ahead of me, the office opens up. Quieter, sharper, honest in a way it has never been before. And wrapped in my grandmother's sweater, I walk forward knowing exactly who I am, and who I am no longer willing to be. Richard is removed on a Tuesday, not dramatically, not publicly. There is no announcement, no email blast, no whispered scandal splashed across the office in real time. His calendar simply disappears from the shared system. His office is cleared quietly before lunch. By the afternoon, his name is already being spoken in the past tense. Before. When Richard was still here. Under the old management. It's astonishing how quickly a person can become history once the structure holding them up is gone. I find out officially in a short meeting with the CEO and HR. The tone is calm, measured, final. "Mr. Coleman's employment with the company has been terminated," the CEO says, effective immediately. No elaboration, no moral lesson, just fact. They thank me, not excessively, not performatively, the kind of thanks that acknowledges impact without turning it into spectacle. My role is clarified. My responsibilities are formalized. For the first time, my work is described accurately, not as support, not as cleanup, but as decision-making authority. When the meeting ends, I walk back to my desk slowly. People look up. Some smile, some nod, some look away, suddenly self-conscious, as if realizing they've been standing too close to the wrong silence for too long. No one congratulates me. That would feel wrong. This isn't a victory lap. It's a correction. At my desk, I sit for a moment without turning on my computer. The office feels different now. Not lighter exactly, but more grounded. Less performative. Fewer loud voices trying to fill space. I touch the sleeve of my sweater. The stitches are still uneven. The fabric still worn thin at the elbows. Nothing about it has changed. Everything else has. At the end of the day, I leave the office earlier than usual. Not because I have to. Because I can. The elevator ride down is quiet, and for once, I don't replay conversations in my head, wondering what I should have said differently. Outside, the air is crisp. The city hums, indifferent as always. Life doesn't pause for revelations. I walk. As I do, my grandmother's presence feels close, not in a sentimental way, but in the way of lessons fully learned. She never believed in loud justice. She believed in alignment, in things eventually settling where they belonged if you stopped forcing them to stay wrong. I remember the last conversation we had before she died. I was sitting at the edge of her bed, holding her hand, terrified of saying the wrong thing. She looked at me and smiled faintly, sensing my fear. "You don't have to carry everything," she said. "I know," I replied. "I just don't know how to stop." She squeezed my fingers, weak but deliberate. "You stop by deciding what's yours." At the time, I didn't understand. Now I do. The sweater was never just a memory. It was a boundary, a reminder of continuity, of dignity that doesn't need permission. The next morning, I walk into the office wearing it again. No one laughs, no one comments, but people notice. And that's the difference. I take my seat, open my laptop, and begin working, not fixing someone else's mistakes, not anticipating disasters created by arrogance, but building something stable, transparent, real. I am not invisible anymore, not because I demanded attention, because I stopped giving my silence away to people who mistook it for consent. When I leave that evening, the sun is setting behind the buildings, casting long shadows across the street. I pause for a moment, letting the light warm my face. "Thank you," I say softly, not to the office, not to the outcome, but to the woman who taught me that strength doesn't shout. It waits. It chooses. And when it finally speaks, it changes everything. I walk forward, wrapped in my grandmother's sweater, carrying her lesson with me, not as armor, but as truth. Silence is power, as long as you choose when to break it.